Like last year, this year's Secret Church went through a small book of the Bible, this time the book of Ruth, a 4-chapter story found in the Old Testament. Now, Ruth has a lot to it, and David Platt went deep into the weeds in Secret Church 24, but there were three main takeaways for me that I took, and the first one is that we can trust in God even through hard times, even through the dark. Because the first chapter of Ruth is marked largely by grief and hardship and suffering, because in the first couple of verses, we see Naomi moves to a foreign land, her sons marry foreign women, and then her sons die and her husband dies, and then she has to move back. And it's a lot of hardship, a lot of hard things that she goes through. But even throughout all of the hard stuff, she still acknowledges God and acknowledges faith in Him and acknowledges her belief in God's great power. Now, when we were watching Secret Church as a family, we were going through a tough, difficult season of life because of some medical circumstances. And even though our medical circumstances were complicated and big and scary at times, this reminded us that God was bigger than it and that He was still in control, even if we couldn't quite see it at the time. Throughout the story, we see a lot of love in the book of Ruth. Not just the romantic love between Ruth and Boaz, but also love from Ruth to her mother-in-law Naomi. So the Hebrew word for love that's used here is hesed, and it describes a kind of love, loyalty, kindness, faithfulness, and compassionate action on behalf of another. So, as you can maybe tell, there isn't really a good English word to translate to from hesed, so our Bibles usually say love or kindness. Anyways, the love, the hesed of Ruth for Naomi and Boaz for Ruth, what it does is it reflects God's hesed for us, you and me. And we see that even though God allowed hard stuff in Ruth and Naomi's life, He still loved them. He still cared for them. He never stopped, being there for him. And we can see His love for the characters through Boaz's love for them, and through Naomi's love and Ruth's love, through the characters' love for each other. One of the major issues that Ruth faced in the story was a need for a redeemer, someone to marry her because her husband had died, to marry her and to care for her, to give her children and a roof over her head, and to provide food and shelter, right? And later on, as the story continues, we see that Boaz redeems Ruth. So just like the love before was a picture of God's love for us, Boaz redeeming Ruth is a picture of how God redeems us through Jesus, His Son. Jesus brings us from death to life, from curse to blessing, from bitterness to happiness, from emptiness to fullness, from despair to hope. Now, this is such an encouraging truth that believers can hold on to and cherish. It should also encourage us to spread the good news of the gospel to other people in our lives. So there is one more thing that encouraged me from the story of Ruth, and that is the fact that Boaz and Ruth, their descendant, their great-grandson, is King David, arguably the best king of Israel. And his descendant, way further down the line, is Jesus, our Messiah, our King. And we see through that God has such a bigger plan for our lives and our stories than just our stories. It's part of a bigger, greater story that He's writing. Because Naomi moved to the foreign land, they met Ruth. And because Naomi's sons and husband died, they moved back. And because of that, Ruth and Boaz got married. And because of that, we got David. Because of that, eventually, we got our king and our Messiah. Now, knowing these things doesn't necessarily make it easier to endure hard things. They're still hard, but at least we can know that God has a plan for our suffering, that He's working all things for the good of those that love Him and are called according to His purposes. I mean, think about it. Ruth and Boaz maybe didn't meet David, their great-grandson, and they definitely didn't meet Jesus, who came way later. But that doesn't mean that God didn't use their hardship and their pain and their story to bring about a greater plan, a bigger purpose that He knew and that we won't know until we get to heaven. So those were my key takeaways from Secret Church 2024. If you enjoyed it, be sure to check out the full Secret Church linked below, because there are so many details and tiny little things that most people miss that David Platt unpacks throughout the 4 sessions. I'm confident that God will speak to you through it and it'll be worth your time. So be sure to check that out. Thank you for watching and see you soon. It is like 85-90 degrees, and I had the AC off while I was filming because it was loud. Gonna turn it back on, maybe. But I was so hot during the filming, it got hotter and hotter and